In the winter of 1943, a German Luftwaffe ace, with over 40 confirmed kills, a man who had dueled Spitfires over the English Channel, hunted Soviet bombers across the frozen Eastern Front, and walked away from engagements that had destroyed a generation of Allied pilots, wrote a single sentence in his personal diary after his first encounter with a new American fighter. He did not write about its speed, though it was faster than almost anything he had ever faced. He did not write about its armament, though 650 caliber machine guns could reduce an aircraft to scrap metal in under 2 seconds. He wrote this: "For the first time since 1940, I felt genuinely afraid in the cockpit." That sentence should stop you cold. Because by late 1943, German fighter pilots were not men who frightened easily. They were the product of a system that had been building aces since the Spanish Civil War. They flew aircraft that were, in many respects, the finest in the world. They had tactical doctrines refined through 4 years of continuous combat, and they were afraid, not of the British, not of the Soviets, not of the early waves of American bombers dying in the hundreds over the Reich. They were afraid of a single American airplane that, by all rights, should never have existed at all. The North American P-51 Mustang was not supposed to be this good. It was designed in 117 days, originally conceived as a stopgap, a medium-altitude fighter ordered by the British because American manufacturers could not deliver on existing contracts fast enough. The Army Air Forces initially used it for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack. It was considered adequate, competent, not extraordinary. For the first 2 years of its existence, the P-51 was a capable aircraft in a war full of capable aircraft, and it was not yet the thing that would change everything. And then America gave it a British heart, and the sky over Europe was never the same again. To understand why the Mustang became what it became, not just a great fighter but the defining air superiority weapon of the entire European theater, you have to understand what was happening to American airmen in the months before it arrived in its ultimate form. Because without that context, the story of the P-51 is just a story about a good airplane. With it, it becomes something far more significant. It becomes the story of how American engineering, combined with British innovation and the blood-soaked lessons of a catastrophic air war, produced a machine that did not just win battles. It changed the fundamental arithmetic of the conflict. It saved the strategic bombing campaign, and by saving the strategic bombing campaign, it made the liberation of Europe possible. That is not an overstatement. That is what happened. In the summer and early autumn of 1943, the commanders of the American 8th Air Force were confronting a reality that the official press releases were not yet ready to acknowledge. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, the doctrine of daylight precision bombing that American air power theorists had championed for over a decade, was bleeding the force to death. The numbers were not ambiguous. On August 17, 1943, a double strike against Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and over 600 men in a single day. On October 14th, a date that would become known as Black Thursday, a second raid on Schweinfurt lost another 60 bombers. 291 aircraft and nearly 3,000 airmen were lost in the month of October alone. These were not minor setbacks. They were losses on a scale that threatened to render the entire strategic air campaign untenable. The mathematics were brutal and simple. If the 8th Air Force continued operations at this attrition rate, it would destroy itself before it destroyed Germany. The problem was not the bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were formidable, heavily armed aircraft. Crewed by men of extraordinary courage, they flew in tight defensive formations designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire. But there was a limit, an absolute and inescapable geographic limit, beyond which their fighter escorts could not follow. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American fighter of late 1943, had the range to accompany bombers to the German border and slightly beyond with help from external fuel tanks. But the industrial heartland of Germany, the ball-bearing factories, the aircraft plants, the oil refineries, the targets that actually mattered, lay deep inside Reich territory, beyond the reach of any escort, and the Luftwaffe knew it. German fighter controllers had mapped the precise range limits of Allied escort fighters with clinical accuracy. They knew exactly where the escorts would have to turn back. They positioned their interceptor squadrons behind that invisible boundary, and they fell on the unescorted bombers with a ferocity that shocked even experienced combat veterans. A gunner and a B-17 crew who survived the second Schweinfurt raid described it later with a simplicity that carried all the weight of what he had lived through. Once the little friends turned back, he said, you could feel it. The whole formation just felt more alone. And then the Germans came up, and they kept coming, and they did not stop coming, and we just had to sit there and take it and hope the guns were enough. The guns were not enough. They never were, beyond the escort line. This was the tactical reality that greeted the P-51 Mustang when it arrived in Europe in the configuration that would change everything. Because the Mustang, with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber, carried enough fuel, internally and in drop tanks, to fly from England to Berlin and back, the deepest targets in the Reich, the ones where German fighter pilots had been flying for 18 months in the comfortable knowledge that the sky belonged to them. That comfort was about to end. The aircraft itself deserves close examination, because the story of the P-51 Mustang is also the story of how the right components, combined at the right moment, can produce something that is far greater than the sum of its parts, and it is a distinctly American story, not in the sense of easy nationalism, but in the precise sense that the Mustang embodied the particular genius of American industrial and engineering culture at its finest. North American Aviation built the original Mustang prototype in 117 days in 1940. The airframe incorporated a laminar flow wing design that reduced drag to a degree that contemporary British and German designers had not achieved in operational aircraft. The laminar flow wing gave the Mustang an efficiency at high speed that translated directly into range and performance. It could slip through the air in a way that other fighters simply could not match. But the original Mustang had a critical weakness. Its Allison V1710 engine lost performance sharply above 15,000 feet. In a European air war fought increasingly at high altitude, the Allison-powered Mustang was simply not competitive. Good at low level, mediocre at the altitudes that mattered. The solution came from the British. Royal Air Force test pilot Ronald Harker flew an Allison Mustang in April 1942 and saw immediately what the airframe could become with a different engine. His report to Rolls-Royce was direct: install the Merlin in this aircraft, and you will have the best fighter in the world. Rolls-Royce engineer Ernest Hives pushed the project forward. 5 prototype conversions were completed. The results exceeded even the most optimistic projections. With the Packard-built Merlin, an American-manufactured version of the British engine, and a remarkable piece of Anglo-American industrial collaboration, the Mustang became something different in kind. Its top speed at altitude leapt to 437 miles per hour. Its ceiling increased dramatically. Its 2-stage supercharger gave it performance that improved as it climbed, rather than degrading. At 30,000 feet, where the Luftwaffe's high-altitude interceptors operated with confidence, the Merlin-powered Mustang could keep pace with virtually any German fighter and outrun most of them. And it could do all of this while carrying enough fuel to reach Berlin. A Luftwaffe technical intelligence officer who examined a captured P-51D in early 1944 wrote a report circulated to senior German air commanders. His assessment was careful, precise, and deeply uncomfortable for the men who received it. He wrote, "This aircraft combines range, speed, and altitude performance in a manner we did not believe achievable in a single-engine fighter. Our tactical assumptions regarding escort limitations must be revised immediately. They were not revised fast enough." The first long-range Mustang escort missions began in December 1943. German fighter controllers had spent 2 years knowing exactly where American escort fighters would turn back. That knowledge was tactical doctrine. It shaped every interception plan, every positioning decision, every calculation about when and where to commit their aircraft. On December 5, 1943, P-51Bs of the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group, flew escort to Kiel in northern Germany, farther than any American fighter escort had gone before. German interceptors scrambled with the confident expectation of finding unescorted bombers. They found American fighters waiting for them at altitude. The after-action reports from German units that day are reports written by men who have encountered something that does not fit their model of the war. But it was the Berlin raids that fundamentally broke something in the Luftwaffe's strategic calculus. When American bombers first appeared over the German capital on March 4, 1944, escorted all the way there and back by P-51 Mustangs, it was not simply a military event. It was a psychological rupture. The Reich capital, a city that had been told it was beyond the reach of American air power, was suddenly, unmistakably reachable. Hermann Goering was later reported to have said, and the authenticity of this remark is well attested by multiple post-war accounts, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. A Luftwaffe flak battery officer stationed near Berlin wrote to his wife in March 1944 with a bitterness that cuts through decades. "The Americans have a new fighter," he wrote. "It comes all the way to Berlin. We were told this was impossible. We were wrong. The men who flew the Mustang are inseparable from the story of the aircraft itself. Technology does not win wars. Technology plus men, trained, motivated, and led with intelligence, wins wars." And the young Americans who climbed into P-51 cockpits in the winter of 1943 and early 1944 were something remarkable. Products of a training pipeline the United States had been building at industrial scale since 1941. Volunteers who brought to the cockpit a combination of aggression, skill, and a certain specifically American confidence that their opponents would come to know well. Consider Don Gentile of Piqua, Ohio. Son of Italian immigrants, he crossed into Canada to join the Royal Canadian Air Force before America entered the war because he could not wait. By the time he was flying P-51s with the 4th Fighter Group, he had 23 confirmed kills, 23 German aircraft destroyed. Eisenhower called him a one-man Air Force. Then there was George Preddy of Greensboro, North Carolina. Quiet on the ground, formidable in the air. On August 6, 1944, in a single engagement over Germany, he shot down 6 German fighters. In one mission, it remains the highest single mission score achieved by any American pilot in the European theater. His commanding officer's report read simply, "Lieutenant Colonel Preddy's performance today defies conventional assessment." And then there were the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, the 332nd Fighter Group, African-American pilots who had fought the United States Army Air Forces itself just to be allowed to fly, who had endured a training program designed by men who expected them to fail, and who, in P-51 Mustangs painted with distinctive red tails for unit identification, compiled a combat record that silenced every argument that had ever been made against them. The 332nd flew escort for the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean theater, and on the majority of their missions they did not lose a single bomber to enemy fighters. They were among the finest fighter pilots the United States produced in the entire war. A German pilot who encountered the 332nd near the Danube in 1944 wrote in his logbook, recovered after the war, "Red-tailed Mustangs. Give them maximum respect." The tactical revolution the Mustang enabled was not simply a matter of range. Range was the necessary condition, but the doctrinal choice made by General Jimmy Doolittle when he took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944 was the sufficient condition. It was a decision that, in its simplicity, was actually radical. Doolittle changed the mission. Under the previous commander, escort fighters were assigned to stay with the bombers, protect the formation. Do not break off to pursue enemy aircraft. This made tactical sense in the abstract, but gave the Luftwaffe a decisive advantage. German fighter controllers could observe the escort, calculate its defensive positioning, and find angles of attack that allowed them to hit the bombers while keeping the escorts occupied or out of position. Doolittle's new order was controlled aggression reduced to its essentials. Escort fighters were to protect the bombers, yes, but they were also to go find German fighters and destroy them. In the air, on the ground, at their airfields. Wherever they were, attack them. Make the skies over Germany expensive for the Luftwaffe to contest. Do not wait for the Germans to come to you. Go to them. This was the doctrine of air superiority through aggressive attrition, and the P-51, with its range and performance, was the ideal instrument for it. A Mustang that had dropped its external tanks and engaged in a turning dogfight at 30,000 feet over Hanover was not giving up very much to the best German fighters available in 1944. And there were a great many Mustangs, and there were fewer and fewer experienced German pilots to contest them with each passing month. A German fighter wing commander whose unit was assigned to intercept 8th Air Force missions in the spring of 1944 wrote after the war with the exhausted clarity of a man describing his own defeat. "The Mustang changed everything," he wrote. "Before, we chose our battles. We attacked when conditions favored us and disengaged when they did not. After the Mustang arrived, there were no favorable conditions. They were everywhere, all the time, and they were very good." To understand what the Mustang meant to the men it protected, you have to sit for a moment with the experience of flying inside a B-17 beyond the escort range. At 25,000 feet, over Germany in the winter of 1944, the temperature is -40 degrees Celsius. Even with the heated flight suit, 4 Wright Cyclone engines produce a roar that has been shaking your bones for 3 hours. Over that baseline, the percussion of flak, the shattering sound of cannon shells striking the airframe when an interceptor breaks through. You cannot speak without the interphone, and the interphone carries everything. The calm voice of the pilot, the sudden shout when someone spots fighters, and sometimes the sounds of men dying, cut off mid-sentence. You have 11 crewmates. You have been living with these men for months. You watch the aircraft to your left take a direct flak hit and fall away trailing fire, and you count the parachutes, and there are only 4, and you know there were 11 men on that airplane, and you turn back to your gun because there is nothing else you can do. Before the long-range Mustang arrived, this was the experience for the entire mission beyond the escort line. Hours of total exposure. And then one day somewhere over Germany, something changed. The fighter escort was still there past the point where they always turned back. A tail gunner who flew his first Mustang-escorted mission in February 1944 described it afterward. "I kept waiting for them to go home, and they did not. They just stayed with us," I cried. Right there in the tail gun position, because those little silver airplanes were still there. That is what the P-51 Mustang meant to the men it protected. The campaign historians call Big Week, Operation Argument, running from February 20th to the 25th of 1944, demonstrated on a strategic scale what the Mustang had made possible. 6 days of sustained heavy attacks against the German aircraft industry, the factories producing the aircraft that were killing American bomber crews. The objective was dual: destroy production capacity and force the Luftwaffe into a defensive battle of attrition it could not win. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its factories. It had no choice, and it paid with something irreplaceable: experienced pilots. The industrial logic of the American war machine, producing trained pilots and aircraft at a rate Germany could not approach, turned every aerial engagement into an exchange the Luftwaffe was losing even when it won individual combats. German pilots who shot down American aircraft were still expending irreplaceable combat experience and risking their lives in a war of numbers that was running against them. American replacements flowed through training establishments in Texas and Georgia and Arizona in greater numbers than the losses they replaced. The Luftwaffe's best men, the ones with 100 kills or more, the backbone of the interceptor force, were dying, and they could not be replaced. A captured Luftwaffe colonel, interviewed by American intelligence officers in the summer of 1944, described the psychological dimension of this attrition with a directness that his interrogators noted as unusual. In early 1943, he said, "My pilots were confident. They believed in their aircraft and in their training. By the spring of 1944, they were afraid, not cowards. Afraid. There is a difference. They had watched the best of us die, and they knew the Americans kept coming with more aircraft and better pilots, and we had nothing new to answer the Mustang." The Luftwaffe attempted responses. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was genuinely revolutionary. A Luftwaffe pilot who flew the Me-262 in combat against Mustangs described its advantage. "The Mustang pilots were very good and very brave, but they could not catch us in the jet. We were simply faster. We should have won every engagement." He then explained why they did not. The Me-262 arrived too late, in too few numbers, with engines that required expert maintenance and burned through fuel at rates that severely limited operational time. American pilots developed specific tactics for catching the jets during takeoff and landing, when the engines were most vulnerable. Technology without the industrial capacity to deploy it at scale is a prototype, not a weapon. The spring of 1944 brought the campaign to its decisive phase. General Eisenhower had made his requirement explicit. On the day of the Normandy landings, the Luftwaffe had to be effectively absent from the skies over the beaches. The months preceding the invasion were therefore used to break it, systematically and without mercy. Mustang pilots attacked not just aircraft in the air, but factories, fuel storage, training installations, and airfields. German aviation fuel reserves, already strained by the broader strategic bombing campaign, came under focused and sustained attack. The Luftwaffe's pilot training pipeline was targeted, and in the air, every German aircraft that rose to contest American operations was engaged at a rate exceeding Germany's capacity to replace it. A German General Staff Planning Officer wrote in his diary in May 1944, just days before the Normandy landings, "We cannot contest the air. We have lost the capability to protect our own territory, let alone the coastal areas. The question of where the invasion will come is almost secondary to the question of what we will do when we cannot prevent their aircraft from going wherever they wish." On June 6, 1944, The Luftwaffe flew fewer than 100 sorties over the Normandy beaches. The soldiers who landed that day did so under an air umbrella of almost total supremacy. What the men on the beaches saw when they looked up at the sky, their own aircraft everywhere and the Luftwaffe conspicuously and almost entirely absent, was the direct consequence of 18 months of grinding work by P-51 pilots from bases across southern England. A German soldier captured in Normandy in July 1944 was asked by his American interrogator about air power. His answer was recorded verbatim in the intelligence report. "They're planes," he said. "Always they're planes. We learn not to move in daylight, not to show ourselves, not to concentrate troops anywhere, because if you were seen, you were dead." We had no answer to their planes. There is a photograph taken at a Luftwaffe base in Germany in the summer of 1944. It shows a group of German fighter pilots, young men in their early 20s, standing near their aircraft. They are not looking at the camera. They are looking up at the sky. The sky is full of vapor trails, the long white lines left by high-altitude aircraft, and the vapor trails are American. The photograph captures something that no historical analysis can quite reproduce. The specific human experience of looking up at a sky you no longer control. Those vapor trails were P-51 Mustangs, flying where they wanted to fly, going wherever the war required them to go. The story of how a British requirement, an American airframe, a British engine manufactured in America, and the doctrine of a general from Bogalusa, Louisiana, combined to produce the dominant fighter of the European air war, is a story about what the United States was capable of when it fully committed its resources, its ingenuity, and its people to a single purpose. It is a story about industrial democracy at war, not clean, not without its contradictions and profound injustices, but formidably, almost incomprehensibly effective. George Preddy did not come home. He was killed on Christmas Day, 1944, shot down over Belgium by friendly fire. A death of savage irony for the most accomplished American fighter ace in the European theater. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group returned to a country that still maintained legal segregation and would fight for decades longer to claim the equality they had earned over the Danube and the Po Valley and the Adriatic. The war was neither clean nor fair. It was won nonetheless. A German Luftwaffe ace who survived wrote in his memoir about the moment he understood the air war was over. It was the spring of 1945. His mission briefing had been canceled for lack of fuel. He sat in his cockpit and listened to American aircraft passing overhead, invisible through the cloud cover. He wrote, "I sat there and listened to them, and I could not do anything. That is when I understood. Not in a great battle, not in a dramatic moment. Just sitting there, listening to engines I could not reach, and knowing they would go wherever they chose, and we could not follow." By the spring of 1945, American air power, delivered at its cutting edge by the P-51 Mustang and the men who flew it, had achieved something no air force in history had achieved before: the virtual elimination of an opposing air force as a meaningful combat factor over an entire continent. The sky over Europe belonged to the United States Army Air Forces. It had been taken, systematically and at enormous cost, over 18 months of attrition that began when a sleek silver aircraft, built in 117 days from an American design with a British engine, first appeared at 30,000 feet over the German border and kept going. 117 days to design an airframe, a borrowed engine, a changed doctrine, and the sky over Berlin was American. That is the story. That is what it meant. And the German pilots who were there, the ones who survived to write about it, confirmed it with the only currency that truly matters in the history of warfare: the testimony of the enemy who could not stop it,